Hello and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly, Change the Message on It, with me, your host, Alex Walsh. Our subject for this programme is free speech, and we're delighted to have as our guest today, Tom Slater. Tom is the assistant editor of the online magazine Spiked, and is leading a campaign against censorship on campus for free speech with no ifs or buts. So Tom, perhaps you could start us off by maybe explaining why you're running this campaign and what's at stake.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for being here today. I think it's fair to say that over the past few decades, censorship has really laid siege to British universities. It kind of became codified in the 1980s when the National Union of Students adopted a no-platform policy, which essentially banned any union member from sharing a platform, so speaking at a public debate or in some sort of public meeting with any person who they deemed to be extremist, fascist, racist, this sort of thing. That policy has generally been discredited. It's broadly been laughed out, seen as very ineffective at tackling extremism. But I think the problem is that the underlying logic of no platform, the idea that you should seal students off in some sort of way from the most abhorrent views in society, has permeated and it's mutated into a slew of new bans that we've been seeing recently. So last year, 2013, was dubbed by the student tabloid The Tab quite aptly, I think, as the year of the ban, in which you saw dozens of universities ban Robin Thicke's pop hit Blurred Lines, as well as the Daily Star and the Sun newspapers under the National No More Page Free campaign. Both were kind of argued for and under the case that they were promoting misogyny and perhaps even a culture of rape at universities. Now, in terms of these bans, as well as many others that have come forward, they're always pushed forward under this idea that they're pushing for more tolerance in society, they're progressive, they're trying to take on some of society's ills. And what these campaigners try to claim is that these songs, these speakers, these ideas more broadly, are somehow holding students and by connection society back, that they need to be tackled in order to defeat them. But what I don't think these campaigners realise is that anything which tries to restrict what people can read, can hear, can listen to in any sort of sense, is the opposite of tolerance and radical change, essentially because it precludes the free and open discussion that's necessary to generally uproot, tackle and just demolish the ideas in society that we seek to change. And I think the point I'm generally gesturing to is that whether it's university management as it was in the past or student unions today, is that censorship is an affront to students. It completely undermines their role intellectually as well as politically, and that students really must throw off any form of campus censorship if they're really going to get on with the job of broadening their minds, challenging backwards ideas where they find them, and just generally changing society for the better.
I think what strikes me the most about obviously being a recent graduate is that actually who are making these decisions on behalf of the student body. So the NUS, obviously the unions and individual universities, have extremely low turnouts, so kind of the AGMs, when they vote on these kind of things like banning the Sun, Daily Star, music. They're controlling what students can buy on campus, what they can listen to, and where are they kind of getting this right from.
And the fact that, you were saying in Cardiff University, I think it was in one of your articles, that they are actually in control of saying that pro-life campaigns shouldn't really be about on campus is really scary to me.
I think coming up on this point of student unions and their kind of lack of democratic mandate is really important, because the one thing that any of these sorts of campaigners and student unions can argue for is that we have democratic mandate for doing this sort of thing, whereas that's just incredibly misleading. Whereas in terms of student unions nowadays, if you get anything that edges towards about 15% voter turnout, that's pretty blinding considering what goes on elsewhere. The kind of case is this isn't censorship, it's a boycott. We're making a stand against this sort of thing, which is just completely false. Because what you have a situation of a group of people who most people either loathe or have very little contact with, making decisions on their behalf, and whether they want to claim that it's got a democratic mandate or not, that's censorship. And I think that's a really crucial point.
I think also this idea of equality. I was part of Feminist Society at my university, and now on the Facebook group, it's increasingly kind of they're kind of censoring what people are saying. They've started applying trigger warnings. So anything that someone has to say kind of has to have a trigger warning before. Now they want to segregate the group and make it only women are allowed to post because of trolls. And what's quite kind of astonishing is that they actually think that they really are kind of radical feminists. They think that what they're doing is really kind of challenging the status quo, but actually, in my opinion, it's actually taking kind of the arguments backwards, and it's doing nothing to advance feminism or freedom of speech, but it's kind of an idea of women need protecting. We need to be protected. We can only discuss in safe environments.
If these societies are themselves implementing some form of trigger warnings or censorship, doesn't that sort of suggest that there is a popular consensus? Isn't that itself freedom of speech, that if many people have the same point of view?
The potential for them to reach that kind of democratic consensus, which in a way could offer some sort of justification for a kind of censorship if the majority rules on that particular issue, isn't really possible given the current climate of student political awareness on campus.
In terms of student unions, do you think that free speech enables them to bend the truth at all?
You imply that with students, you believe in order to liberate them and to enlighten them, that all of society needs to remove forms of censorship, including, the non-hate speech legislation. I just wanted you to consider the fact that these legislations are passed, they're implemented primarily for those that are the most vulnerable in our society. So I would like to question kind of where you stand on that belief. I believe that a lot of people who have thick skin and not so easily offended do stand up for themselves. And these legislations kind of are the backing for our society to defend those who don't defend themselves.
Your point about safety on campus, I think, is really important, because what's happened as the kind of previous modes of censorship have kind of rolled back slightly, been like no platform, been discredited. You've had the rise of this language of safety, and what has, if anything, kind of taken the place of no platform has been what they call safe space policies, which the NUS have adopted. And I think this is a very dangerous situation, because previously, when the language of safety was brought in to try and restrict what could and couldn't be said, what speakers couldn't come and speak at campus, it was done with the idea that there would be genuine violence. It was somewhat wrongly, as I would argue, but nevertheless the idea that if you invite a certain speaker down, some sort of race riot or something like that could ensue. What's happening now is that that language of safety is being deployed to just the idea of the exchange of ideas, not even necessarily problematic ones. What's fascinating about the safe space policy, which many universities have now adopted, is that it even gives unions the power to police aggressive forms of debate. And I think that just shows you the trajectory that censorship tends to go in, especially when it goes unchallenged, in that it promotes this idea that not even that certain ideas are necessarily explosive, but that students and more broadly people themselves are just too delicate to even take part in it. And I think that's something that through trigger warnings and through safe space policies really needs to be challenged when it comes up. At the moment, of course, these bans are going through with very little democratic mandate, but what if you could have a legitimate one? What if 99% of a campus turned out and voted in favour of a ban, in favour of a no platform policy? Obviously, it's a hypothetical question, and broadly speaking, everywhere that we've gone and spoken at, what has been encouraging is to find that the vast majority of students do think these bans are ridiculous, but they're just so alienated from the unions to try and overturn it. But that having been said, even if that was the case, even if 99% of the student population turned out in favour of one of these bans, I still think that would be ill-fitting, and that would be unbefitting students both academically and politically, because censorship is not necessarily always something that is handed down from on high. It can be something that is called for on occasion, but the point is that free speech as a practice is something that students should adopt and should really champion, and if they're calling for that themselves, then that's just as problematic. And I think the problem is that essentially the issue with hate speech legislation or forms of censorship, essentially to try and protect certain groups, is that it's never historically really been effective. I mean, for instance, one country that had some of the most virulent anti-hate speech laws and anti-religious hatred laws was Weimar, Germany. And of course that did nothing to quell the rise of Nazism. If anything, it was used by the people who were prosecuted under it to kind of profess a certain marginalised status on behalf of them. They're saying the mainstream don't want to listen to our viewpoint, they're criminalising us. So historically, I think it's never, it's been proven that really what you need is a kind of open forum in which to tackle these things. But obviously that relates to the point you were making insofar as is freedom of speech essentially possible when you have, in practice, can it always be progressive when you have certain groups who can bend the truth, maybe have a bigger platform than one another. And I think there's always going to be the case that certain people, depending on what platform they have, will be able to shout louder than other people. But the thing is that you, by having faith in free speech, you have faith in other individuals, no matter how lowly they may be in society, to be able to challenge that. And I think, again, historically, that's kind of borne out. Because outside the discussions we're having at the moment, throughout history, you've had groups who are generally marginalised, not necessarily by popular opinion, but actually by the state, who have managed to kind of overturn these situations. So, for instance, under the logic that we're talking about, the suffragettes would have never have come about because no one came along to introduce a law that allowed them to make the points that they were making. Free speech is not necessarily something that's doled out to you or kind of managed in some sort of way via officialdom. It's something, a lot of the time, that is seized and then enacted, and I think that's something that's being lost when we talk about free speech almost being an illusion in that sort of sense.
Is there a case for free speech ever being dangerous if used inappropriately?
I think that could be one of the things that people in power are scared of, who try and censor free speech, is because they don't want people guided too much who don't know enough about certain situations, because you will have the groups, the masses, who are not quite filled in, and it takes that one guy to really just steer them in the wrong direction.
I would say that that's a really elitist argument to have, that kind
Right.
of the masses aren't educated enough to kind of distinguish between kind of good and bad. I would say that actually it's so much more dangerous restricting free speech, because people are always going to say bad things, and that's part of the principle of free speech. People will say good things that you agree with and bad things that you don't, and you need that in society. You need that to be a free and democratic society.
Free speech can also go in the direction where, newspapers and intellectuals and other people also voice their arguments to counteract these people who are, saying things that are potentially hurtful to other people. There are people in newspapers and editors and things like that who can check them and who voice their opinions in that sense. And in that way, you hear both sides of the argument and you're able to make your own decision. And I think that with your point, Jace, I feel like you're maybe underestimating people's moral autonomy in choosing whether they are right. Like, you don't have to be the most intellectual person to know that maybe genocide and things like that, or just not liking someone because of their race, is wrong.
But because we now have a general consensus as a society that there's certain terms and there's certain things we shouldn't be putting onto other people, we can join together and kind of combat that through that legislation, say that is actually hate speech, you are discriminating and we're going to stand against you. So we kind of give people the right to say what they want to say, but know that they're going to be held accountable for it. And that can't be an entirely negative thing.
I would always make a distinction between words and actions. You can't suggest that a form of speech is necessarily going to be dangerous or violent in any sort of direct sense. I think that's something we have to be clear on. But at the same time, I want to kind of defend the idea of free speech as something that is genuinely quite risky. Because, again, at university campuses, with these safe space policies, the idea is that you can have discussion on this very kind of even, nice, cuddly kind of plane, which is just ludicrous. The whole idea is that it can be aggressive, it can be quite forthright, but it's a clash of ideas, and through that you've got some idea of getting towards the truth of the matter or pushing for something more progressive. So I think the risky and sometimes potentially dangerous in a sense nature of free speech is something that we should actually embrace. And I think coming back to the question of hate speech and saying that it's a mechanism through which we can hold people accountable for what generally the consensus of society is deemed to be problematic language or problematic viewpoints. I think the problem is that it's almost the reverse. It's not, as you characterise it, a case of people coming together and saying, we're holding you accountable for this. It's a clear-cut rule. It's a top-down law that tells someone what they're saying is problematic and criminalising for that. It's not holding them accountable, it's criminalising them, which I think is different. Because what happens is you then negate the possibility for anyone to hold them accountable. They still hold that view. They've just been criminalised for it. They haven't been subject to the kind of proper criticism and proper debate necessary for them to be A, possibly change their mind, and B, be discredited in the public forum, so anyone else who may have some sort of inkling towards what they were saying were shown to see that it was backwards.
What you just said is hate speech has no direct threat. I can name a million cases where someone's been attacked on the internet in their local supermarket, and the effect that it has is detrimental on how they feel about themselves and where they stand in their worth in our society. So saying that it has no direct link or correlation to actual problematic experiences or physical harm is completely avoiding all of the possibilities of what hate speech does to the individual.
I'm not saying that all words are just words and they don't have associations, they don't have a certain politically charged nature because of their history or whatever. What I'm saying is that there's a fundamental difference between words themselves and maybe the ideas that underpin them. So for instance, in a situation where someone's espousing fiercely racist views or something like that, the issue is not the words that they're saying, it's the kind of ideas that underpin them. So you can't tackle what they're arguing for by just saying you can't say that word. You have to take on their arguments, and the only way to do that is not through bans, it's not through censorship, and it's definitely not through legislation. It's through free and open debate. So I think that's the distinction we have to make.
Where you draw the line between freedom of speech and downright verbal abuse, I want to kind of talk about Andre Lampert a bit, because he was in the news recently, UKIP member, who's in a lot of trouble because of some very dodgy tweets he made One about Islam saying it was pathetic and satanic religion. One about Nigerians saying they're all generally bad. And he made, probably the most shocking one was Africans should start killing themselves off. I don't know what context that was in, but it's very disturbing and dangerous, really, as someone to tweet such things. So how do you feel about that? Do you think he's simply exercising his right to freedom of speech, or is this more serious? Is he downright verbally abusing a section of society?
I think it's really interesting that we've got into a position now, this idea of verbal abuse, the thing that people don't really take into account, that's relatively new, this idea that abuse is traditionally something that's physical, but this idea that words alone, words are like bullets, they can really hurt people. And I think what we need to recognise is that this is a brand new concept. And what it really keys into the fact is that a belief in freedom of speech is usually directly correlates to how much you believe in human beings' capacity to A, make up their own minds about certain things, but also a certain resilience as well. I think if you're in a situation which we are in today in the context of campus bans, in the context of the Public Order Act, where people are painted as not only quite irrational, the idea they can't be exposed to certain types of views, whether it be UKIP or anyone else, without kind of unthinkingly imbibing them and perhaps going out and creating vicious acts. But also the flip side of that is that we have this notion of human beings as so fragile, so incapable of kind of hearing certain problematic types of speech that they will actually incur some sort of harm that we'd usually associate with physical violence. I think that's what's really troubling. And again, it gets into a situation where you negate any possibility of people being able to react against it. If they're apparently so disarmed, so almost maimed by the words that are flung at them, that there's no capacity within them to react against them. And I think that's really problematic.
Ultimately, being able to actually freely speak and kind of challenge status quos is so much more important than being, kind of called nasty names. And obviously I do agree that there can be the lasting kind of side effects. Maybe it's not very nice, but you don't need legislation, you don't need to be told not to do that, to actually have a conversation and actually be able to challenge those kind of horrible racist ideas, rather by no platforming and by kind of making university students actually childlike by saying you can't think this, you can't even see this, your brain can't literally take in these kind of vile ideas. You're not even allowing a conversation to begin.
A handful of people who are going into university are 18 and over, and it's not like we put rules and regulations, well there are rules there, but not as strong, I don't think, as in university, in the workplace, which of what people can say or can't say and stuff like that. And it is like the students are being babied as though they're not prepared to hear this, or it might damage them in the long run or something. Surely a lot of students move away from home and move into campus and halls and stuff. If they can move into halls and cook for themselves and live a life of independence in a way, why are they being protected against certain things that they're going to be facing in the future anyway? They'll probably be exposed to it at a different point in life anyway, so why are they being wrapped up in cotton wool?
I keep hearing everyone's arguments, and I'm just thinking one of the issues with universities is that they don't want to insult people. I think that may be the reason. But so if you did take insulting out Section 5, then they haven't got anything to sort of fall back on, because it's understandable if you're running an organisation, you want to stop any form of disruption of that.
But I think the problem is the distinction we have to make if we're going to defend free speech is not just about being insulting, it's also about the idea that it can pose genuine violence. Because the issue with legislation is not the fact that it problematises it under the idea that it could be insulting. It's also that it suggests it can create direct harm, it can incite hatred, it can genuinely lead to violence. And that is the core fallacy that I think we need to get past, because it's where all of these other things come from. There's this fundamental idea, and this quite misanthropic idea, that words in and of themselves can either send people a bit loony and just, almost against their better instincts, just go and start beating up, black people just because they've been told to. And the other aspect that, on the flip side of that, that people who that language is perhaps being used against are going to be completely reduced to some sort of quivering wreck just by hearing it. And I think that's, if we're going to defend free speech, it can't just be in these kind of individual terms. It can't be about people should have the right to be offended. Also, people should have the right to be genuinely abhorrent, and people have the right to be bigots. And if we're going to defend free speech, we have to do it for those most abhorrent views as much as anything else.
I think if you broaden it out as well, kind of just from outside of universities into kind of society at large, Spurs supporters that obviously say the Red Army, it's not meant to be a racist kind of term, but the police now, the government, are actually clamping down on the use of weird. So I think within the NUS, it's all about, we don't want to insult anyone, we want to make sure it's a good environment to learn, but actually that's kind of a microcosm of actually a wider kind of situation, and where increasingly it seems like we're being policed constantly about what we can and can't do, and can and can't say.
I completely agree with you, because with that example of Spurs fans going to games and shouting yids and stuff like that, if you ask a lot of Tottenham fans, a lot of my friends are Tottenham supporters, and they say it's a term of endearment. They don't mean it in any negative way or an offensive way. Some people get a bit touchy about it because they believe it's a derogatory term for a Jewish person. But I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to that word insulting, and it's such an ambiguous word. And I completely agree with you also. They should be taken out of Section 5, because I think it's so, what it may insult me may not insult you. So it's very kind of hard to judge what is insulting. You can't have some sort of way of testing it, can you? What insults different people, may not insult others. But I think with that, and seeing Celtic fans getting arrested in Scotland for singing songs, I think is utterly ridiculous. I mean, people getting arrested for that and getting that on their criminal record, I think is frankly disgusting.
I think Tom's point about the newness of psychological abuse as a term is interesting, but I think that to say that psychological abuse is somehow inferior or not real compared to physical abuse is an oversimplification of the fact. However, I do agree that to sort of create universalized laws about what does and does not denote psychological abuse is not acceptable, because at the end of the day, one of the most important things about psychological states and psychological awareness is that people are subjective. But I do also think it's important to remember that psychological harm isn't a fantasy. I don't think that it is a fantasy, and I think that the link between a person's mental state and physical actions isn't invisible, and it's not non-existent.
I would say, picking up on your point, Alex, about UKIP saying that all Africans should go kill themselves. As an African myself, I'm speaking for myself personally, myself only. That comment doesn't necessarily bring me to my knees, and if I had to choose between people on Twitter saying these racist things or the concept of free speech, where public figures and people in government and stuff are basically controlling what people say and how people express themselves, for me is a way bigger issue. So I'd probably choose free speech over my respect, or not my respect, but the idea that people should be respectful towards one another and things like that. While I do agree that that is an important part of society, I think that free speech is a bigger issue for me.
I'm not against free speech, saying that. I'm not against free speech at all, but what I'm saying is that, if free speech is a gift and it must be, used with respect, and people should really, kind of think about what they say before they say it, because I'm not saying that people will hear such things like that, as Andre Lampert said, and fall to their knees crying and, never be able to do anything again. I'm not, it's not as dramatic as that, but what I'm saying is, saying something like that comes with all kinds of baggage. Mm-hmm. You can't just say something like that and expect to get away with it purely on the basis that, I have freedom of speech, I can offend who I like, when I like.
I don't agree that free speech is a gift. Free speech is a right. It's a fundamental right to human beings in whatever country you're in, and that actually censorship does nothing to solve the issues of why people are saying mean, horrible things that may cause offence, but it does nothing to get to the root problems. And people should respect one another, but at the end of the day, everyone has the right and has the liberty of free speech.
I never said it's not a right though. I said it's a gift. I said it's a gift because it's a gift we have in this country. It's a blessing to have it.
So who's giving it to us?
I think that free speech is a right. I don't think it is a gift, but I think that it has power, and that as individuals who have fought for the right to have that power should be respected. We should therefore pay attention to the ways in which we use it.
That's qualifying a right though. That's qualifying kind of a universal. How can you qualify something that everyone should have?
Because I think that even though we have it, I think that it still gives us an ability to influence each other in society, which we shouldn't just take for granted.
I think there's a couple of underlying kind of fallacies, basically, I think we need to put to rest here. First of all, free speech is not a gift. It's a right. It's something that is fought for and something that is then enacted off the behalf of the populace who have fought for it. And the second thing is this idea that freedom comes with responsibilities. I think that's a really difficult idea. I think freedom means, and believing in freedom and arguing for it, is arguing for it to be a clash of ideas. Sometimes that's messy. Sometimes people are irresponsible with how they exercise their speech, you might say. But that's a question of temperament and maybe the particular political ideas they espouse. But that's not really the question. You defend free speech for all as a right, or you defend it for none at all. It's not a gift. It's not something that's handed down to those who are deserving. I think that's really crucial. I think the problem is that when you say we need to defend free speech as a right, people think it's almost as if you're doing it on purely almost abstract terms. It's just this idea that it's something natural that we must defend on behalf of everyone. I think that's true. But at the same time, the point is the fact that it's also genuinely a progressive idea. It's the best means we have by which of discrediting dodgy ideas, pushing forward new ones and fighting for a better society. The only time you get into a situation where free speech looks compromised, where the idea of that clash of ideas looks problematic, is when you have a very degraded idea of humanity. And that's why with this campus campaign, with the Free Speech Now project more broadly, it's about reinvigorating the meaning of freedom of speech, but that also means reinvigorating our belief in individuals and their capacity to sort wrong from right, to make up their own decisions, and to push for a more progressive society. That's what it's all about.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to our very special guest, Tom Slater, for leading a very interesting discussion. If you'd like to get involved with Don't Shout at the Telly in the future, then please do email us. Thanks for watching.